the Batman. It's about time you showed up.
We're going to do a new episode.
Well, it's about time.
Yes, it is. Welcome to the Arkham Sessions, brought to you by Comics Alliance. I'm Brian Ward, and as always, I'm joined by...
Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
Hello, Drea.
Hi.
We have enjoyed a good week of a podcast where we sort of took a little bit of time away from Batman the Animated Series, sort of. We talked about Batman the Movie from 1989.
That's right.
Not to be confused with Batman the Movie from 1966. But if you've not been able to hear that one, I recommend going back, taking a listen to that, because we actually tie it into Batman the Animated Series pretty well, I think. And I think it's a good episode.
Thank you. I do too.
Yeah. So this week, we are returning to Batman the Animated Series, and it's with an episode that I really quite enjoy, very action-packed, and kind of cool, if for no other reason than our good friend David Wise wrote the episode. This is an episode called The Clock King, and it turns out to be a favorite of many people online.
And it turns out there happens to be a lot of psychology within this episode.
Right off the bat.
Yeah.
I mean, normally we'll take an opportunity to sort of run you through the episode. We'll go scene by scene if we need to in order to get to the big reveal, and we'll talk about what's wrong with the person. This one, we don't even have to do that. We are given things to talk about from the moment the episode begins.
6 minutes behind schedule.
So let's begin. This is The Clock King. It was written by, like I said, David Wise. It was directed by Kevin Altieri. And we start out on a train 7 years ago, pre-Mayor Hill. He is an attorney. We are introduced to Temple Fugit.
Oh, right. The efficiency expert.
Which actually sounds very similar to the Latin tempus fugit, which means time flies. And, I don't think that that's a coincidence, seeing as how this particular gentleman is obsessed with time, even breaking down his daily schedule to the minute. And he knows exactly what it is he's going to do when. He is very, retentive, I would say. In fact, I would go so far, I don't know, Drea, you're the expert. I, as a layman, am thinking maybe O.C.D.
Well, you said anal retentive, which is not a psychological term, not a diagnostic term, but that is a common term conversationally that people use to describe what is obsessiveness. And that's what we're seeing at the very beginning of this episode. We see this guy who's very meticulous, very rigid. He has his day scheduled to the minute. And in fact, when he sees Counselor Hill, he can tell him exactly how long it was that they met to the day.
We've only been taking the same train every day for 1 year, 7 months, and 13 days.
And on the train, he pulls out his schedule. And on his schedule, he has his day set out. And we get a glimpse of what that schedule looks like. Of course, he has meetings and his hearing, very important hearing that day. Mm-hmm. But he also has details in his schedule that most of us would not be putting in our agenda books. Things like coffee break, brush teeth, check weather. Again, not something that most of us would be putting in our schedule, and they wouldn't be within, couple minutes of each other. So we see immediately that this guy not only seems to be particularly meticulous and has this very detailed memory of events, but also is so ordered that he has his day planned out by the minute. Now, Brian, you mentioned O.C.D.
Yes.
Well, in fact, we don't actually see the full presentation of OCD here. So let's talk about OCD for a minute. We haven't talked about OCD before on the show. OCD is an anxiety disorder. It's characterized by obsessions and compulsions. What are obsessions? Obsessions are intrusive, anxiety-provoking thoughts that seem to be repetitive, come out of the blue, and causes a lot of distress in the person. Compulsions are behaviors, rituals, or acts that try to relieve the anxiety caused by the obsession. So it's this compensatory, anxiety-relieving behavior or ritual. Most people think of things like hand-washing, counting. What are other forms of OCD you've heard of?
Entering a room multiple times,
right,
or turning lights on and off.
Right, so turning switches on and off a certain number of times. And so we see with OCD typically this initial intrusive, anxiety-provoking thought or image, and then this act, ritual, mental, compensatory type of behavior following that. With what we're seeing with Temple is not so much obsessions and compulsions, to our knowledge. I mean, it doesn't seem as though he's fighting these intrusive thoughts and then reacting to them. We see more of this overall long-standing behavior of rigidity and order. So what Temple seems to present with is something called O.C.D, obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. Again, now we're delving into personality disorders. So what is O.C.D? It's a type of personality disorder with rigid adherence to rules and regulations, this overwhelming need for order, an unwillingness to yield or give responsibilities to others. That means that in order for things to be right, they have to do it themselves. It's also this sense of righteousness about their beliefs, that they know how things should be done, and other people don't quite have that same knowledge that they do. When you see people with OCPD, they tend to have this excessive devotion to work, this sort of avoidance of or lack of social interaction because they're so devoted and committed to the work that they're doing. Like I said, an excessive fixation with lists, rules, very, very minor details, this perfectionism that often interferes with either finishing tasks or being effective and efficient at times, and even a lack of generosity or really a lack of empathy because, again, they're so fixated and dedicated to this order that they've set out for themselves.
So one seems to be a considerably more severe case of the other.
Right. Well, people with OCD have insight, meaning they're aware of their unwanted thoughts, and they're certainly aware of the anxiety that they feel. Again, it's an anxiety disorder. It causes them a lot of distress. And most people with OCD will say, I would like this to be gone. Like, I would like this to be cured.
But people with OCPD don't feel anxiety. In fact, they think that they're better for it.
Yeah, OCPD think their way is the right way and the best way. And actually, they usually feel very comfortable with their way of doing things. And although people with OCPD may not have the most fulfilling, connected relationships, again, because they're so dedicated to this rigidity and order, and as a side note, because most people find them unlikable and may not want to spend too much time with them given the way that their personality is, there's usually no other major interference in their life. They're usually quite successful in what they do, and they typically select some kind of employment or career that allows them to be the way that they are.
So I don't mean to overstep any bounds here, but to me this also sounds a little bit like Asperger's syndrome.
That's actually a good point, because if you see this presentation that the Clock King has, you might say, oh, he seems to be disconnected from others, he seems to have poor social skills, he seems to have this special interest, which are all the characteristics of someone with what was formerly known as Asperger's disorder, and what now in the new DSM-5 is just simply part of what we call the autism spectrum. And what's actually very different between OCPD and Asperger's is that Asperger's or any disorder, is that Asperger's or a developmental disorder on the autism spectrum is just that, a developmental disorder. And so we have this almost innate, seen from a young age, this lack of social skills, this sort of fundamental underdevelopment of social skills. Whereas with OCPD, that disconnectedness and poor social skills seems to be a result of that personality trait of rigidity and order.
So just to be clear, per the most recent edition of that DSM, Asperger's is no longer a thing unto itself?
Well, it's no longer considered a category or a mental disorder. It's not a diagnosable mental disorder.
It just falls on the spectrum.
It's no longer a label. It's now well, let me put it this way. The constellation of symptoms that was once considered the label, Asperger's disorder, is now contained on what we call the autism spectrum. So there are you could say that this particular individual or child falls in the autism spectrum, and you can give that diagnosis.
Gotcha.
It's a little bit of a tangent, but I wanted to make sure when we talked about Asperger's that, folks know that's no longer a label. But let's get back to OCPD. So the difference is that OCPD develops later in, I would say, probably late adolescence, maybe early adulthood.
So you won't find a small child going around making meticulous lists.
Well, there you go. If you see a small child starting to develop some of that rigidity and even this, what we call a special interest, that's where I would start to wonder if they were on the autism spectrum.
Gotcha. Okay, so it's good to differentiate.
And I don't want to say that somebody can't have both, but one is a developmental disorder, the other is a personality disorder. And with OCPD, it tends to be very particular to that rigidity and order, and it could come out in a number of ways, like making lists or schedules, or somebody counting money. Again, depending on what it is that they do for a living.
And as we see in this particular episode, Temple Fugit owns a company that is an efficiency company, someone who is specializing in time management skills and things like that. And
exactly.
And he is currently going to trial for a $20 million lawsuit against his company for some reason. We're not sure why. That could end up bankrupting the company if he is found, if they are found guilty or liable or whatever. And so, so he's gone into this career based on his own rigidity.
Exactly. Well, no one is better suited to do this kind of job than the Clock King.
Right.
I shouldn't call him the Clock King yet because he hasn't turned into the Clock King.
Right.
Temple Fugit. No one is better suited than he is. And actually, what we found through kind of going back into American history, actually, we can see that a lot of people who have exhibited traits of OCPD have been some of the most successful pioneers and inventors and just brilliant people in our, like I said, our history. So this is an interesting episode in that it shows somebody with these kind of quirky, unlikable, certainly psychologically questionable type of behaviors, but we learn that he's really good at what he does and that he's perfectly suited to do this really important job.
So when you say certain people who have succeeded with OCPD, one famous example, of course, would be Steve Jobs. A lot of people thought that he had signs of OCPD.
Yeah, I guess folks thought that while he was difficult to work with and while his kind of single-mindedness, his focus on all the Apple development and products, he was one of those people that was able to take that expertise, that again, that dedication and commitment to better this product and essentially to rise above, and that's clearly why he was so successful. And in fact, as I said, there's a large body of research devoted to the link between successful, high-achieving personalities and some degree of mental illness. So again, OCPD is considered a mental illness, but we can identify some very well-known people that have traits of OCPD that have been particularly successful.
I'm a civic-minded citizen with a lot of time on his hands.
So does that then make sense how OCPD is different than OCD?
Yes.
Someone with OCD might spend hours and hours, counting and washing their hands and checking things, and they often become paralyzed by those behaviors, and they're so much in distress by those intrusive thoughts. Whereas we say folks with OCPD are inspired by those thoughts. It helps them and encourages them to keep doing what they're doing and even to be quite successful above and beyond other people.
Gotcha. So we learned that Fugit is in charge of this company. He's got a big settlement against him. And Hill sees that he is tightly wound. He even says,
You seem pretty tightly wound this morning, Fugit.
like a watch. And actually suggests that,
Loosen up. Do something to relax before you go into court. Get out of your routine for a few minutes.
so I have a question. Would it be good or bad for someone with such a rigid routine on such an important day to deviate from said routine? And how easy or hard could it be for someone to do that?
All of the questions. Let's just say this. When we rewatched this and Hill tells him, just to relax and take your coffee break later, I immediately got very nervous because no, I would say that's not recommended on a really important day. If you have a really important speech or a really important presentation or, exam, something that is, has high stakes, do not change something that's very important to you. Like for someone who's that meticulous, I would not change a single thing because routine and order, something that you're familiar with, does provide generally comfort and familiarity and does help in our success. Like down the line. And with someone like Temple, that's particularly important for him to be able to have everything in order for him to be successful. Because again, the reason he's successful is because he is so ordered and meticulous. So no, I would say that is a bad piece of advice for that day, for this person. Now, on the other hand, now let's go back to OCD just for a moment. Somebody with OCD who has this distress associated with their illness should absolutely begin to learn to be more flexible and try out experiments. I mean, essentially he's giving him what we call an exposure. Instead of 3 o'clock, take your coffee at 3:15 and see what happens. Now, if I were his therapist, I would say, test it out, see what happens. Does your worst nightmare occur? Does the worst possible scenario occur? Do you survive this? Because that's essentially what your brain is telling you. If you don't take your coffee at 3 o'clock, you will not survive. Something terrible will happen to you. And so normally I would say, yeah, that's something that I would advise somebody with OCD. And I would even say with someone with OCPD, those are some day-to-day practices that someone can do to make their lives a little bit easier. So normally I would say these little changes in the schedule could actually be helpful for someone with OCPD and with OCD, but not on this day. This is a day that's very important. Now, you also asked if this was an easy thing for someone with OCPD to do. And no, normally someone with this level of OCPD would not be willing to take and in fact, we do see him deny, we do see him say, I'm not going to do that. And he's visibly anxious by that. We see him respond to this suggestion with some distress.
So does that put him back into the potential OCD category?
Not necessarily. It just reinforces the idea that this person believes that he's better off and believes that he's more successful and better functioning when he's in this tight, orderly, routine. So that anxiety would be, I would say, would be particularly normal. But he has this initial reaction that's negative. And then later in the episode, he shocks his secretary when he says, I'm going to take my coffee out in the park at 3:15. He actually takes Hill's advice. And that is a little bit uncharacteristic, but it makes for a good plot.
Yeah, especially since his papers end up going all over the place. Fugit ends up late to the trial, and as a result, the judge finds in favor of the plaintiff. Fugit's company goes under, thus creating the Clock King.
Yes. So that one little domino, taking that coffee break a few minutes later in a different setting, set off a series of dominoes that led to the most catastrophic outcome, which is, losing this $20 million case, and confirms for Temple, this is the consequence. This is the true realistic consequence of what happens if I do not stick to my order, if I don't stick to my schedule.
So we move to 7 years later, where Hill is now mayor, and Fugit is plotting his revenge against him, and he seems to be doing it in ways that make Hill look incompetent, and he uses time to do that. So Hill will have a scheduled event, and it will go awry. Such as he'll be driving to a certain location, he'll be stopped, and then suddenly, at that moment, a banner will come down making Hill look like an idiot. Mm-hmm. That's where Batman first encounters the Clock King. We see that later in the episode, Hill is opening up a new train depot, new train station. The train is not only late, but two trains come barreling toward one another head to head, destroying the train station, again making Hill look like someone who is incompetent.
Right.
And this is all because over these last 7 years, presumably, Fugit has been learning everything, such as a certain train is always 6 minutes early, or is always, he's almost turned time into a superpower.
Mm-hmm. He's even turned his little pocket watch, as we see later, into some kind of weapon where he twirls it around and then tosses it toward Batman and it explodes.
Yeah, it's like an exploding bolo. Yeah. Or he's got different kinds for different purposes. And they're very expensive watches.
He's a fancy villain. I noticed he was dressed, when he introduces himself as the Clock King, he's actually dressed the same way, very neat, very orderly. He's still very much obsessed with time, but he does have that kind of grandiose belief, that feeling of superiority, and he appears to be much more sophisticated in so many other ways than the people that he's dealing with.
Oh, absolutely. He definitely appears to look down on everyone else for their inadequacy in time management, etc.
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about how you might treat someone with this when talking about how Hill tries to get him to become a little less rigid. But as a psychologist, in a position where you would treat this person on a daily or weekly schedule, how would you go about getting this person treated? And is it necessarily something that needs to be treated if they do in fact feel like their life is better off if they're sticking to a rigid schedule? Like, is this hurting them? Is this hurting anyone else? Is this...
Yeah. Well, prior to Temple transforming into the Clock King and becoming more destructive, I would say he's in fact somebody who perhaps would never seek counseling or treatment. Mm-hmm. I've actually only seen maybe one or two individuals with OCPD, and usually it's because they have concurrent O.C.D, depression, or some other mental illness that they want to work with, or that they want treatment for. Typically, people with OCPD, as we talked about before, all these traits are in alignment with their personality and with their sense of self. So it's something that we call egosyntonic. That means that these traits or series of symptoms are found to be not problematic and in alignment with a person's psychology and a person's personality. Now, that doesn't mean that someone with OCPD wouldn't be impaired. Sometimes if the symptoms are very severe, that person can be very socially isolated, like I said, could be experiencing depression, anxiety, and could ultimately feel like their life, because they're so fixated and, striving toward perfection, that could cause some interference. But for the most part, people with this particular personality disorder tend to be fine with it and do not seek treatment.
Gotcha. So the episode ends exactly as it would for someone obsessed with time, in a clock tower, in a very Castle of Cagliostro-esque ending, with Batman trying to save Hill, who is strapped to the hour hand of the clock, and the Clock King with his cane that looks very much like a clock face hand, very sharp, very much used also like a sword. And the two of them are going at it inside with all the gears and the workings of the clock. And of course, as would tend to happen in situations like this, that cane slash sword weapon goes into a gear, causing the entire clock tower to crumble and collapse, and it's presumed that the Clock King is dead. Mm-hmm. Batman, of course, thinks...
You think we'll hear from him again?
I wouldn't be surprised, Commissioner. In fact, I'd say it's only a matter of time.
In prepping for this, we actually got the opportunity to talk to the writer, David Wise, a friend of ours, about creating this incarnation of the Clock King. The Clock King had actually been around for a while as a Green Arrow villain, and then he'd also made an appearance in Teen Titans. But this is a completely different version. Temple Fugate was created for this episode, and I actually kind of prefer this particular incarnation of the Clock King to any that we had seen prior. Talk about what David had told us.
Yeah, well, I reached out to David, and we chatted about the development of this character and what inspired him to create Temple Fugate. And he said that he went to a very strict private boys' school when he was growing up, and he based the Clock King on, not on one particular person, but on his experience with various teachers who had these characteristics of being, very overly rigid and punctual, and were fixated on order. And in line with what we're talking about, those teachers sounded also to be unlikable. And you see that immediately with this character. Most people watching the episode do not like him. They're frustrated with him. And you know what? We kind of want something bad to happen to him. So when something bad happens to him, we're all feeling a little bit satisfied. And in fact, Wise said he kind of liked the idea of messing up the life of someone who is obsessed with every wretched detail of, a plan or schedule, and who feels something akin to physical pain when they have to alter their schedule in a certain way. And I agree with him that someone so ordered and fixated on time and schedules and lists would feel very frustrated and in distress if those things were somehow messed up or interrupted.
Interesting.
David Wise also points out that there seems to be this self-sabotaging characteristic of Fugate that, you asked, would he really go to the park with his coffee on such an important day? And Wise actually said he was trying to show this self-perpetuating psychological system. Now, I would call that self-sabotage, right? That I am so right, and I am so, my beliefs are so correct that if I do this, my expectation is that something bad would happen. And in fact, something bad did happen.
So he's proving to himself and to the world around him that his way is the right way.
Exactly. And I think he wants to prove it to Hill, which is why later he develops this, this vengeful hatred and goes after, he doesn't go after the Batman. He doesn't go after anyone. He's really just targeting Hill to get him back for essentially destroying his life.
And he also believes that Hill, because Hill's law firm was on the other side of the case, that Hill was somehow trying to sabotage his livelihood as well.
Yeah.
His life.
And that's, that's somewhat delusional. That clearly wasn't the case. And I think, I want to point out that for us as viewers, we also, again, we feel this satisfaction. We feel this sense of kind of wanting him to fail because we were so uncomfortable and irked by his personality. I just want to bring that back and have us reflect on what it's like for us to interact with someone who has either OCPD or even OCD, or someone with Asperger's or someone on the autism spectrum. And so I want to say two things that are really important to me about this episode that I like so much. One is that when we see the Clock King turn to being destructive and homicidal, that's the part that's unrealistic. That's the part that makes, BTAS the way that it is. This really is about Batman going after the villains. So while I very much like that, that's unrealistic, and most people with this kind of personality disorder would not turn to that kind of level of destructiveness, and would not likely develop into that kind of a person. The other thing I wanted to say is that, as David Weiss says, there is this feeling that we have as viewers of satisfaction and almost kind of a good feeling when we see this very bad thing happen to Fugit. His entire day, his career is practically ruined. And I think, I want to reflect on that because, we did feel this sense of frustration, and we even kind of didn't like this guy in the beginning because he was so meticulous and orderly, and he reminded us of people that were like that. And, I just want to reflect on how it feels for us when we're interacting with people in real life who could have OCD or OCPD, or even what we talked about, someone on the autism spectrum who is by nature so orderly and fixated on this special interest, or so meticulous about one particular thing, and how, yes, that makes us very frustrated and annoyed with that person, and our reaction is to get away from them. And sometimes we feel like we just want them to learn their lesson, so to speak, to learn that doesn't get you anywhere and that's not how to live life. But I think that feeling is very... I think that while that feeling is very realistic, it somehow, I don't know, it humbles us, right? Because that's just how that person is. That's how their brain is wired, and that's what they're doing to kind of to do the best that they can. And in some ways that brought them success. So you're looking at me like I'm crazy.
No, not at all.
Okay.
I'm actually looking at you because everything you're saying right now, go with me here.
Yeah. Is this how you feel? All the time?
No. Even better. I would like to reconsider my earlier stance, and I would like to adjust it so that I can say that I think Batman might have OCPD.
Oh, no.
Because of his meticulousness, his expertise, his rigidity. We've talked about his rigidity in terms of, and that his way is the best way, and that sometimes we want to see him proven wrong. E.g., Christmas with the Joker, when he keeps obsessively saying that some crime is going to happen, and then he follows some kid, some punk kid, and then it turns out that punk kid is returning a purse to the little old lady instead of stealing the little old lady's purse, or whatever. Robin keeps trying to prove, look, sometimes the world is not how you think it is, and you kind of want him to be taken down a peg or two, and he is taken down a peg or two. I'm going to say, from here on out, and I'm going to think about it for the next week, Batman has OCPD.
Let's reflect on that as we go through the next few episodes, because to be honest, I hadn't considered that. I don't know how I feel about that right now, but you draw upon something that's really important for this episode, and perhaps important for how we're dealing with Batman and when we get frustrated with Batman. That when we do respond and react to people who have these kinds of traits, that rigidity, that orderliness.
The inability to interact with others.
Yes, that social isolation for something that we don't find value in. I think that we should take a step back and reflect on why they're doing what they're doing. And I think you said it, when you brought up Batman, and it applies for this character, the Clock King, too. That's their way of trying to stay safe. That's their way of meeting what are otherwise unmet needs. And we get frustrated, and we think it's wrong, and we don't understand, and we want them to be like more like us, and we believe that they could have more fulfilling lives if they weren't like that. But that lacks the empathy. That response lacks the empathy that we really need to have.
So ultimately, I think this was a really good episode. I enjoyed it. It's got swashbuckling, sort of fighting in clock towers. It's got rigid schedules. It's got exploding trains. It's really got everything that we could want in a good Batman cartoon.
Yeah, and as I said, it's psychologically satisfying on many levels.
Mm-hmm. Join us next week when we'll return to Crime Alley with an appointment in Crime Alley, which is actually an adaptation of a Denny O'Neil comic book story. So we get to see how that translates to the small screen when Jerry Conway adapts that one. And, we get to return to our old friend Roland Daggett in this one. So I am very interested in seeing how the appointment in Crime Alley plays out. So join us next week. Until then, you can find us on Twitter. We are at Arkham Sessions.
I'm at Arkham Asylum Doc.
And I am at bward028. You can also find us on Facebook. Like us there. You can also email us. We are arkhamsessions@gmail.com.
And a huge thanks to Comics Alliance for sponsoring us. You can find them at comicsalliance.com.
Cool. So until next week, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
And we are
the Arkham Sessions.